One of you pointed it out to me on Twitter. They said, hey, is this Pate State material? I said, what is it? Oh, it's an article by Ari. Okay, I'll go look. And you're seeing on the screen right now, I retweeted it. I like to give credit where it's due. And I felt like I wrote it. I felt like I wrote the article. I felt like I wrote the feature. So you will have to pay. I'm not going to sit here and do story time. We don't have a campfire over here where we're going to gather around and I read this to you. But boy, oh boy, our man hit it out of the park. I'm talking about one of those home runs like in Houston where it can go all the way over the tracks and out of the stadium. That's what he did to this story. So the entire premise was about what we'll lose by going to a 12-team college football playoff. I am not here to relitigate this. I know, respectfully, that there are many in our audience that are fully on board with playoff expansion. I get it. No one's changing their mind here. I just want to point out it's good to finally, have some more folks sitting over here on our side of the canoe for a change, because that thing was really tilted up in the air. There are some good points made here. See, I've always been willing to concede there are going to be some pretty awesome aspects of an expanded playoff. Playoff games on campus, for example, as many of them as they're willing to give us, those in and of themselves will be incredible spectacles. No one, at least on this show, has ever disagreed with that. No one on this show has ever disagreed that there will be more games with playoff ramifications on them in November. No one here, none of us, look, all of us here, no one has ever disagreed with that. But there is collateral damage done in the process. You don't just get without giving something up. So the entire question has always been, and should have always been, is what we're giving up worth what we're getting? If you support expansion, this is where we differ. Your answer to that is yes, it's worth it. And where I differ is my answer has been no. What we give up is more than what we get. That's really where our opinions, I guess, diverge. But Ari Wasserman made the point, and it was a brilliant quote. It was so brilliant that I actually want to pull it up. Last week was an incredible week, and it fascinated me as we were going through it, different people's perspectives. Because I had a lot of folks glued to Tennessee, Georgia. I had a lot of folks glued to Alabama, LSU. And these are the same people who tell me that they've longed for a postseason model that keeps some of these big boys out, keep the same teams away from the table, and yet they're watching a regular season game where Bama's playoff life is on the line, and they lose. And you're going crazy all over the country with excitement, and they storm the field in Baton Rouge, and yet the expansionists are watching a playoff game happen, and they don't even realize or acknowledge it as a playoff game. And Ari, he wrote the following: there were no college football playoff logos on the field in Baton Rouge on Saturday, but we all got a playoff game in November. You sure did. You absolutely got a playoff game in November. You're probably going to get a playoff game when Ohio State plays Michigan. You got a playoff game when Ohio State went up there and played Penn State. The beauty of the current structure of this sport is you don't have 4 playoff teams. You got a bunch of teams that are playoff worthy, and then they filter themselves down to a finite final few, but there are playoff games all throughout October and November in this sport. Always has been that way ever since they expanded it. The regular season urgency is something that you cannot duplicate, you cannot manufacture it. There are a lot of different folks out there with different opinions on what kind of detrimental impact playoff expansion will have on the regular season. If you're like me, you're in these environments and you understand the way Tennessee, Georgia felt last weekend will not be felt in the expanded playoff era. Now, those of you who support expansion, you say it's worth it. I simply say it's not worth it because there is nothing else like that on earth, or at least in the continental United States. There is no other sporting environment like that. I was there last week. There's nothing. And what you cannot do is you cannot expand the playoff but put seeding on the line or maybe a first-round bye on the line and expect folks to treat that game the same way and expect the college football public to feel the same way about that game. Won't happen. It simply will not happen. The urgency that this sport has, the no safety net effect that this sport has, is its most precious commodity. The integrity of the regular season, the most precious commodity. Anyway, you've heard me talk about that. But here's what I want to draw your attention to for a second. So, for the longest time, the convenient argument, it was a dishonest argument, and I knew it at the time, but for a long time, some of the more dishonest casuals amongst the campfire started telling you, we've got to expand the playoff. And you said, why do we have to? That's pretty forceful language. Well, don't you see what Alabama's doing? Don't you see what Clemson's doing? Don't you see that they're using the current playoff model to distance themselves? Because it is a vicious, self-serving cycle. The precious few make it in, and then they profit off of it, figuratively, of course, and literally, and then they further distance themselves and separate themselves, and we're just going to have superpower programs. And how will we ever rein Alabama and Clemson back in if we don't make these changes? You notice how no one said that this year? You notice how you haven't really heard that said the last few weeks amongst the expansionists? We need expansion to keep Bama out and keep Clemson out. Yeah, it's because it was always a dishonest argument, because that was never what was needed. What you needed to do is sit around and wait. And that's really all you needed to do, because that's the way this sport works, even in the modern day. And here's the other thing. It's kind of a harsh realization. If you've been peddling that garbage for 4 or 5 years, you have to face the fact now that the only hope that Alabama and Clemson would have this year is your model. Mine is the one that would keep them out, which you say you've wanted for so long. Yours is the one that would have 2-loss Nick Saban in Alabama saying, guys, look, season hasn't gone the way we want, but as we all know, we've got to lose at least a quarter of our games before we're out of the playoff. Like, how lame is that? Do you imagine Alabama having more wiggle room? Can you imagine Clemson having more wiggle room? That's what you guys are signing up for. Now, let me tell you what happens there. What happens there is you got folks say, well, remember, Josh, remember now, it was never about crowning a different champion. We're realists. We all know the same champions will largely be crowned, but it's about the journey. We want to make the journey more meaningful for more people. We've got to make November matter for more teams. No, you need to go sit by the garbage for a little while, because you're the one who made November meaningless when you convinced folks that if they're not playing for a playoff spot, their games don't mean anything. See, in 2007, no one said meaningless November game. No one said that. That phrase had not even been born yet. In 2009, no one talked about meaningless bowl games. It was the expansionists that came along and decided to worship at the altar of the CFP and worship at the altar of a lot of folks who wear suits worth more than their wardrobe that they'll never meet, looking to line their pockets and fool you in the process into supporting the process that will line their pockets. And you fell for it. Hook, line, and sinker. And you got convinced that if you're not playing for the playoff, what does this 8-win team playing in November mean? Nothing. It's meaningless. So you don't get to make the mess, but then instruct me on how to clean up the mess. Now, if you made the mess, you go sit in timeout and you let folks who aren't responsible for it clean it up. I'm not going to trust you to clean up your own mess. You're the one who made it. Go sit over there. So I am respectfully, but forcefully, not really interested in the people who made the mess, the people who created this false notion that there are meaningless games in November. I'm not interested in their solution for how we make those games mean more. Never been interested in that. And the other thing that Ari Wasserman hit in this piece on The Athletic that was brutal, but to the point, is the everyone deserves a path argument. Everyone's got a path. Well, let me rephrase, because everyone doesn't have a path. Everyone who needs to have a path to a national championship in major college football has a path. Because as he says in this piece, and as is the case, there is no Power 5 college football team that begins the season with no path. Because there's no Power 5 college football team in a 4-team playoff format that's going to go undefeated and not have a spot in the playoff. It won't happen from today moving forward. It will not happen. Your counterpoint is, well, there's more to college football at the major level than just the Power 5. And that's where the cold, hard truth has to be swallowed. There shouldn't be. If we're truly worried about crowning a national champion in major college football, the cold, hard truth is acknowledging the University of Georgia and Georgia Southern do not play the same sport. And it's always been foolish to pretend they do. LSU and Tulane, respectfully, do not play the same sport at the same level. the letters FBS, pretending that there's this umbrella under which 130 or 131 equal teams reside, is nonsense. I was in Athens last Friday night, and I toured that facility. They've got stuff there you would not have in Statesboro, Georgia, if you ran that program at peak efficiency for another century, and they just stood still in Athens. You're existing on different planets. That's not a knock on Georgia Southern. It's a great program in Statesboro. It's just a different world. We all understand that. Even the most ardent of expansionists in the room understand that. Yet why in the world do we believe the answer is lowering the bar, which should be excellence, to include you in a tournament to crown a champion? Why is it that we were concerned about lowering the bar to just be very good instead of excellent for the sake of inclusion and including teams to make people feel good, I guess, from these pools here that have no comparison to the oceans over here? Makes no sense. It never has. What I've always been a supporter of is a separate playoff for the G5, if you want to call it that. I've always been a supporter of that because there's logic behind that. There's no logic in pretending that Miami of Ohio and the University of Miami play the same sport. They don't. One has access to things the other will never have access to. It's not the NFL. First off, there are 32 teams in the NFL. So when you tell me, well, everyone's got a shot at their postseason, the NFL stands for National Football League, first off. It is an entity that solely exists for football to be played within. Colleges were not built with football or athletics in mind. They came along in some cases decades later, in some cases over a century later, and everyone's got different stuff, and everyone's got different rules, and everyone's got different geographical limitations. It's not perfectly congruently built. It's never been that way. And so, we've tried to kind of shoehorn it in to a model that most readily duplicates what the pro models do. It's never been meant for that. And so, Ari, I would encourage you guys to go read this. I could go all day on this. I would just leave you with this and ask yourself this. Are you complicit in supporting the devaluing of our most precious commodity simply to line the pockets of people you've never met and you'll never know? Because a lot of you are. And I don't want to tell you how to think, but I'm going to tell you how to think. There's going to come a day down the road where we get this. We're not fighting against it anymore. It's going to happen. We all know that. I get that. I am telling you unequivocally, there's going to come a day down the road where we're there and you look around and it looks so good on the outside, and then you get inside of it and you realize, is this it? Is this it? Because just as sure as a lot of us, myself included, who cursed the BCS up and down and longed for the 4-team playoff, look back with regret now, so too will you. A lot of you will look back with regret at this 4-team model that you curse up and down, and you want more meaningful games, and you know the talking points. I don't need to repeat them. And you're going to get there, and you're going to realize what you had and what you lost. It's that lyric that I stole from Stevie Nicks and Fleetwood Mac at the beginning of the show. It's only right that you should play off the way you feel, but listen carefully to the sound. Number 9 on the Greatest Hits album. Thanks for watching, guys. Don't leave yet. Don't leave yet. Make sure you like the video and please subscribe to the channel. Not just for me. That's how we keep this entire thing free.